7, 6, 11, 5, 9 and 20 miles today, 4, 11, 17, 32 the day before. Boot, 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 moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. Don't look at what's in front of you. Boot, 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 moving up and down again. Men go mad with watching them. There's no discharge in the war. If your eyes drop, they will get the top of you. Boot, 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 moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. 7, 6, 11, 5, 4, 17, 32 the day before.
The echoes of war at Sedan had scarcely faded when Otto von Bismarck stood in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, watching his king accept the imperial crown of a unified Germany. January 18th, 1871 was more than just a symbolic moment. It broke the equilibrium that had kept Europe steady for generations. Behind the Prussian Chancellor's calculated satisfaction lay the seeds of catastrophe, for in creating his new empire, he had wounded French pride beyond healing and set the stage for alliances that would one day tear the continent apart. Across the Rhine, defeated France writhed under the humiliation of her dismemberment. Alsace and Lorraine, provinces rich in iron ore and heavy with Germanic influence, now flew different colors. Their loss cut deeper than mere territorial concession. It represented national mutilation that no patriotic Frenchman could accept as permanent. In cafes throughout Paris, veterans of the Franco-Prussian War nursed their wounds and their resentment, speaking in hushed tones of revenge that must surely come. This burning desire for revanche would reshape European diplomacy for the next 4 decades. French statesmen, their nation isolated and vulnerable, sought allies who might help restore their violated frontiers. Meanwhile, the Iron Chancellor understood that his new creation had made Germany the object of perpetual French hatred. Every diplomatic move, every treaty negotiation, every military alliance would now revolve around this fundamental antagonism between the two great powers of Western Europe. Russian Tsar Alexander II watched these developments from his palace in St. Petersburg. Petersburg with the keen interest of a ruler whose empire stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. His vast domains had been humiliated in the Crimean War, their military weakness exposed before all Europe. Now, as German power consolidated and French ambitions for restoration grew clear, he saw opportunities to restore prestige while securing his western frontier against potential threats. Across the North Sea, British statesmen observed the continental upheaval, with traditional detachment tinged by growing concern. Their island kingdom had prospered for generations by maintaining the balance of power, preventing any single nation from dominating Europe completely. Now, with German unification accomplished and French resentment simmering, that careful equilibrium appeared dangerously unstable. Bismarck's genius lay in recognizing that his creation had transformed him from revolutionary to conservative. Having achieved German unity through blood and iron, he now sought to preserve what he had built through careful diplomacy. The Chancellor understood that France, burning for revenge, would inevitably seek allies for a war of restoration. His task was to ensure that when that moment came, Germany would not stand alone. Secret negotiations in the early 1870s produced the first threads of what would become an intricate web of alliances. Austria-Hungary still reeling from her exclusion from German affairs and her defeat at Königgrätz, found herself drawn into partnership with her former enemy. The dual alliance of 1879 bound these Germanic powers together against potential Russian aggression, creating the foundation for a larger coalition. Emperor Franz Joseph, ruler of the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire, saw in this partnership a chance to stabilize his troubled domains. His dual monarchy faced challenges that would have overwhelmed a lesser state: competing nationalisms, economic disparities, and the constant threat of Balkan instability. German support might provide the security needed to manage these internal pressures while maintaining great power status. Italian unification had created another factor in the evolving balance. King Victor Emmanuel II ruled a newly united peninsula, but his kingdom remained weak, impoverished, and burdened by internal divisions between North and South. When Bismarck offered partnership, Italian leaders recognized an opportunity to gain great power recognition while securing protection against French ambitions in the Mediterranean. The Triple Alliance that emerged in 1882 linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in a defensive coalition that appeared to guarantee stability. Each partner gained security against specific threats: Germany against French revanche, Austria against Russian expansion, Italy against French interference. Yet this very success in creating a stable bloc inevitably pushed other powers toward counter-alliance. French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux spent years cultivating relationships that might break his nation's diplomatic isolation. Russia, with her vast armies and resources, offered the most promising partnership. Their autocratic government might seem an unlikely ally for the French Republic, but common fear of German power overcame ideological differences. Secret negotiations culminated in the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, creating a military partnership that flanked Germany on two fronts. Tsar Nicholas II, who had inherited the throne following his father's assassination, found himself drawn into commitments that would test his empire's strength. Russia's alliance with France promised financial support for industrial development, while providing diplomatic backing for Balkan ambitions. Yet these benefits came at the price of automatic involvement in any Franco-German conflict. Across the Channel, British policymakers watched this alliance system develop with growing unease. Their traditional strategy of splendid isolation seemed increasingly outdated as continental powers organized into opposing camps. When Kaiser Wilhelm II began challenging British naval supremacy with his ambitious fleet-building program, London faced a choice between accommodation and confrontation. Wilhelm II embodied the contradictions that would ultimately destroy European peace. Grandson of Queen Victoria, yet jealous of British maritime power, he combined genuine admiration for English institutions with deep resentment of their global dominance. His erratic personality and inflammatory rhetoric often undermined the careful diplomacy that might have preserved peace between the Germanic powers and Britain. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, architect of German naval expansion, harbored no illusions about challenging British supremacy directly. His risk theory suggested that a powerful German fleet might deter British interference in continental affairs by threatening costs too high to bear. Yet this very strategy ensured British hostility, as no maritime power could tolerate a direct challenge to the naval supremacy upon which their empire depended. King Edward VII brought to the British throne a cosmopolitan sophistication that contrasted sharply with his nephew's bombastic style. His state visits and diplomatic initiatives helped create the atmosphere necessary for British engagement with continental affairs. when French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse proposed resolving colonial disputes through comprehensive agreement, the king's influence proved crucial in overcoming traditional antagonisms. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 marked Britain's abandonment of splendid isolation without creating formal military obligations. France recognized British control in Egypt while receiving British support for her ambitions in Morocco. More importantly, both powers agreed to resolve their global colonial disputes through negotiation rather than confrontation, freeing them to focus on the German challenge. Russian defeat in the war with Japan had shaken the Tsarist Empire to its foundations, exposing military weakness and sparking revolution that nearly toppled the dynasty. Foreign Minister Alexander Izvolsky recognized that his country needed time for recovery and reconstruction. Partnership with Britain might provide the security needed for internal reform, while resolving the great game rivalry that had divided the two empires for generations. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 partitioned Persia into spheres of influence, while establishing British control over Afghanistan and Russian dominance in Outer Mongolia. These arrangements eliminated potential sources of conflict, while creating the framework for cooperation against German expansion. With this agreement, the Triple Entente emerged as a counterweight to the Triple Alliance, dividing Europe into opposing camps. Yet even as these grand alliances took shape, deeper currents of change were transforming European society in ways that made peaceful resolution increasingly difficult. Industrial revolution had created military capabilities that dwarfed anything previous generations had imagined. Steel production enabled the mass manufacture of artillery and small arms that could equip armies numbered in millions rather than thousands. Chemical industries that produced dyes and fertilizers could equally well manufacture explosives and poison gases. Railroad networks that carried commercial goods could rapidly transport troops and supplies across continental distances. Telegraph systems that connected financial markets could coordinate military mobilization with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Population growth throughout Europe had created demographic pressures that strained traditional social structures while providing enormous reserves of military manpower. Germany's population had grown from 41 million in 1871 to over 65 million by 1910, creating both economic dynamism and pressure for territorial expansion. France's slower growth from 36 million to just 39 million left her feeling increasingly vulnerable despite colonial expansion. Military service had become a universal experience for young European men, creating mass armies that reflected national will rather than professional competence alone. German military theorists spoke of wars of peoples rather than kings, conflicts that would mobilize entire societies for struggles involving every aspect of national strength. Such wars, they understood, would be decided not merely by battlefield skill, but by industrial capacity, financial resources, and popular morale. Naval competition intensified these pressures by creating visible symbols of national power that captured public imagination. When Britain launched HMS Dreadnought in 1906, her revolutionary design rendered all existing battleships obsolete, while inaugurating an arms race that would consume enormous resources. Each new class of warship represented not merely military capability, but national prestige that governments could not afford to sacrifice. Public opinion, increasingly influential in democratic and semi-democratic societies, often pushed governments toward confrontational policies so that professional diplomats might have preferred to avoid. Newspapers competed for circulation by emphasizing international tensions, while popular literature celebrated military virtues and national superiority. Veterans organizations and patriotic societies provided organized support for aggressive foreign policies. Yet even as Europe armed and organized for conflict, many observers believed that economic interdependence would prevent major war. International trade had reached unprecedented levels, creating financial relationships that crossed political boundaries. Banking networks centered in London, Paris, and Berlin facilitated transactions that made European economies increasingly dependent on peaceful cooperation. Norman Angel's influential work, The Great Illusion, argued that modern warfare had become economically impossible. The costs of industrial conflict would far exceed any possible gains, making rational governments reluctant to risk their society's prosperity for uncertain military objectives. This optimistic analysis failed to account for the non-rational factors, pride, fear, honor, and nationalism, that often drive political decisions. The Balkans emerged as the region where these conflicting pressures would ultimately explode into general war. Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908 had inflamed Serbian nationalism while demonstrating Vienna's determination to expand southward. Russia's support for Slavic aspirations conflicted directly with Habsburg survival needs, creating an unstable situation that only required a spark to ignite. Serbian officers who had organized the coup that brought their dynasty to power maintained connections with secret societies dedicated to South Slavic unification. The Black Hand, led by Colonel Dragutin Dimitrievich, combined military professionalism with revolutionary fervor in pursuit of a greater Serbia that would unite all South Slavs under Belgrade's leadership. Such ambitions directly threatened Austria-Hungary's multinational structure. Archduke Franz Ferdinand represented his empire's last hope for peaceful evolution toward a federal structure that might accommodate Slavic aspirations while preserving Habsburg rule. His marriage to a Czech countess demonstrated sympathy for Slavic culture, while his political views favored constitutional reform that would grant autonomy to ethnic minorities. Yet these very qualities made him a target for extremists who preferred revolutionary destruction to gradual reform. The Archduke's decision to observe military maneuvers in Bosnia during June 1914 provided Serbian conspirators with an opportunity they could not resist. Vienna's choice of June 28th, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, that foundational defeat in Serbian national mythology, seemed deliberately provocative to inflamed nationalist sensibilities. Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old and dying of tuberculosis, possessed the desperate courage that dangerous conspiracies require. His training in bomb-making and marksmanship had been provided by Serbian military officers who understood that political assassination might trigger the general war that would liberate their people. Standing on the streets of Sarajevo that fateful morning, he embodied the convergence of nationalist passion and international crisis that would destroy European civilization. When the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn, stopping directly in front of the young assassin, the moment of decision had arrived. 2 shots from a Serbian pistol would kill not merely an Austrian prince, but the peace that had preserved European prosperity for nearly half a century. The Great War was about to begin, though none of the participants could imagine the horrors they were unleashing. Behind this single act of violence lay decades of alliance building, arms races, colonial competition, and nationalist fervor that had transformed Europe into a powder keg awaiting ignition. The complex web of relationships that had been designed to preserve peace through balance of power had instead created mechanisms that would spread local conflict across the entire continent. As news of the assassination flashed across telegraph wires from Sarajevo to Vienna to Berlin to Paris to London, the carefully constructed alliance system began its fatal operation. Military planners, who had spent years perfecting mobilization schedules, now found their clockwork preparations driving events beyond political control. The age of kings and cabinets was ending. The era of mass warfare and total conflict was about to begin. In the warm summer of 1914, European civilization stood at its zenith, prosperous, confident, and seemingly secure. Yet beneath this surface stability, the forces of destruction were already in motion. The shots fired by a tubercular teenager in a provincial Balkan city would echo across 4 years of unprecedented carnage, destroying empires, toppling dynasties, and reshaping the world beyond recognition. Such was the power of the machine that statesmen had built in their quest for security through strength. The alliances designed to prevent war would make war inevitable. The armies raised to preserve peace would destroy a generation. The balance of power that had protected European civilization would become the mechanism of its temporary destruction. Heaven help them all, for they knew not what they had done. Thunder rolled across the Belgian frontier as German artillery announced the opening of humanity's greatest conflict. Dawn on August 4th, 1914, revealed grey-clad columns streaming across neutral territory in precise formations that stretched beyond the horizon. The Schlieffen Plan, 17 years in the making, was finally unleashing its mechanical precision upon an unsuspecting world. General Helmuth von Moltke, the Younger, stood in his Berlin headquarters, watching colored pins advance across enormous maps that reduced nations to geometric abstractions. His uncle's legacy weighed heavily upon shoulders that bore responsibility for an empire's survival. The plan he inherited promised swift victory through a massive right hook that would sweep through Belgium, envelop Paris, and eliminate France before Russian mobilization could threaten the eastern frontier. Speed was everything. German planners had calculated that 42 days would suffice to crush French resistance, leaving ample time to redeploy divisions eastward before the Russian steamroller could threaten Prussia's vulnerable borders. This clockwork precision demanded that every division reach its assigned position according to predetermined schedules that allowed no deviation for unexpected circumstances. Belgian resistance shattered these carefully laid timetables within hours of the invasion's commencement. At Fort Eben Emael, ancient cannon belched fire at advancing German columns, while Belgian soldiers fought from crumbling ramparts with rifles older than their grandfathers. What German intelligence had dismissed as obsolete stone proved capable of delaying entire army corps for precious days. Each hour lost in reducing these medieval fortresses meant fewer resources available for the crucial advance toward Paris. King Albert himself rode through Brussels on August 4th, his sword drawn as he addressed his parliament in words that would echo across Europe. "I have faith in our destiny." His small army, though hopelessly outnumbered, fought with desperate courage that extracted a terrible price from invading divisions already behind their ambitious schedule. Civilians fled in horse-drawn carts piled high with furniture and crying children as the grey tide rolled westward. In villages across Belgium, farmers who had never heard a shot fired in anger took potshots at German patrols from church bell towers and barn windows. Whether real or imagined, these franc-tireur activities triggered harsh reprisals that would blacken Germany's reputation throughout the neutral world. At Louvain, German soldiers set fire to the ancient university library, while professors wept in the streets. Flames consumed 300,000 irreplaceable manuscripts as Allied propagandists watched their greatest gift unfold. The burning of Louvain became a symbol of enemy barbarism that would feature on recruitment posters from London to New York. British intervention materialized with shocking swiftness as the Royal Navy's guns thundered their defiance across the North Sea. Within days of the invasion, the British Expeditionary Unit was crossing the Channel aboard requisitioned passenger steamers, their brass bands playing Rule Britannia, as Dover's white cliffs disappeared behind them. Sir John French commanded barely 100,000 men, yet their professional competence far exceeded their numerical strength. The encounter at Mons on August 23rd provided the first test of British resolve against German efficiency. Private Sidney Godley of the Royal Fusiliers crouched behind his machine gun as wave after wave of German infantry advanced across the Mont-Condé Canal. His sustained fire created such devastating casualties that enemy officers reported facing entire battalions of machine gunners, where only skilled marksmen actually operated. This miracle of Mons bought precious time for French troops to complete their mobilization. Meanwhile, General Joseph Joffre embodied the methodical competence that would save France in her darkest hour. His imperturbable calm under pressure masked a strategic intelligence that grasped the conflict's essential mathematics better than more brilliant colleagues. While politicians fled Paris and allies retreated in disorder, he quietly gathered reserves from every corner of the empire. Zouaves from Algeria, colonial troops from Senegal, territorial divisions from the remotest provinces. Plan 17, France's own strategic masterpiece, had called for immediate offensive action that would liberate Alsace-Lorraine through sheer audacity and patriotic fervor. Reality proved far different from theory, as French armies, in their bright red trousers and blue coats, discovered that Elan could not overcome machine guns and artillery firing from carefully prepared positions. At the Battle of the Frontiers, entire regiments vanished in minutes under German fire, their officers dying with swords drawn while leading charges that belonged to another century. Captain Charles de Gaulle, a young infantry officer, watched his regiment melt away at Dinant as German bullets swept their ranks like invisible scythes. The frontier clashes of August cost France nearly 300,000 casualties, while achieving nothing except the demonstration that modern combat had changed beyond recognition. Russian mobilization proceeded with surprising speed that caught German planners completely unprepared. General Alexei Brusilov's armies advanced into East Prussia ahead of schedule, their Cossack cavalry ranging deep into enemy territory, while church bells in Königsberg rang out warnings of approaching invasion. This premature offensive would cost Russia 2 entire armies, yet it may have saved France by forcing the Germans to divert precious divisions eastward. The Battle of Tannenberg became a masterpiece of tactical destruction that established German reputations while eliminating Russian threats to Prussia's heartland. General Paul von Hindenburg emerged from retirement to command the defense. Yet the real genius belonged to his chief of staff, Erich von Ludendorff, whose tactical innovations turned Russian strength into weakness. Under cover of darkness, on August 26th, German units executed pincer movements that surrounded General Alexander Samsonov's Second Army in the forests around Tannenberg. Russian soldiers found themselves firing at shadows, while enemy artillery zeroed in on their positions with mathematical precision. By dawn on August 30th, the encirclement was complete. 92,000 Russian soldiers lay dead or captured among the pine trees, their rifles stacked in neat pyramids while German soldiers counted hundreds of captured guns. Samsonov himself, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his failure, walked into the forest and shot himself rather than face the consequences of decisions that had doomed his men. His body was found days later by German patrols, a loaded pistol beside his head and tears frozen on his cheeks. Victory in the East, however spectacular, could not compensate for deteriorating German positions along the Western Front. General Alexander von Kluck's decision to wheel inward toward Paris had exposed his army's flank to French attack, while abandoning the plan's original concept. The gap that opened between his forces and those of General Karl von Bülow created the opportunity that Joffre had been waiting for. On September 6th, Parisian taxicabs commandeered by military authorities began carrying 6,000 fresh reserves to the front lines. Drivers who had spent their lives navigating city streets now found themselves ferrying soldiers to humanity's greatest battle. The sight of these humble vehicles streaming toward the sound of guns became a symbol of democratic improvisation, triumphing over Prussian systematization. At the Marne, French soldiers rose from their trenches on September 9th and advanced across open ground while German machine guns chattered their deadly song. General Ferdinand Foch, commanding the French Ninth Army, sent his famous message: "My center is giving way. My right is in retreat. Situation excellent. I attack." His men, many of them 40-year-old reservists with grey beards and aching backs, charged forward with bayonets fixed. The German retreat from the Marne marked the moment when swift victory slipped beyond reach forever. As enemy columns withdrew northward, French and British troops followed cautiously, hardly daring to believe that the invincible German army was actually in retreat. The race to the sea that followed demonstrated that mobility retained importance even after entrenchment began, as each side sought to outflank the other through extensions of their lines. By November 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the Swiss frontier to the English Channel. What had begun as a mobile campaign was becoming a siege on an unprecedented scale. In muddy ditches barely 6 feet wide, millions of young men began digging the graves of European civilization. The Christmas truce of 1914 provided a brief moment of humanity amid the mechanized slaughter. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers began singing Stille Nacht in their trenches, while British troops answered with Silent Night from across no man's land. In sectors all along the front, enemies climbed from their holes to shake hands, exchange cigarettes, and play football in the frozen mud between the wire. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers wrote home, "The Germans were really magnificent in the whole thing, and jolly good sorts. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant, I should think, and being a bit of a collector, I intimated to him that I had taken a fancy to some of his buttons. We both burst out laughing, and he cut a couple off his tunic and gave them to me. For a few precious hours, the war stopped. Then the whistles blew, and the killing resumed. Chemical weapons made their horrifying debut at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. German engineers opened the valves on 6,000 cylinders of chlorine gas, while favorable winds carried death toward Allied trenches. French colonial troops, unprepared for this new horror, fled choking and blinded as yellow-green clouds rolled across the battlefield like fog from hell itself. Canadian troops hastily rushed to plug the gap, urinated on handkerchiefs and pressed them to their faces as they advanced through the dissipating gas clouds. Private John McCrae, serving as a medical officer, watched his friend die horribly from gas poisoning, then wrote the poem that would capture the war's tragic beauty. In Flanders, fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row. At sea, the Royal Navy's blockade began its slow strangulation of German commerce. Admiral John Jellicoe commanded the Grand Fleet from Scapa Flow, his battleships and battle cruisers patrolling the grey waters of the North Sea like steel predators seeking prey. Every German merchant vessel that tried to break through the invisible barrier found itself confronted by British guns that spoke the Empire's will. Germany answered with U-boat campaigns that threatened Allied shipping lanes with a new form of warfare. On May the 7th, 1915, U-20 torpedoed the passenger liner Lusitania off the Irish coast, sending 1,198 souls to the bottom, including 128 Americans. The sight of women and children drowning in the cold Atlantic waters provided Allied propagandists with another atrocity to fuel the hatred that sustained the war effort. Ottoman entry into the conflict during November 1914 opened new theatres that would stretch Allied resources to the breaking point. Enver Pasha's decision to join the Central Powers created opportunities for jihad against British and French colonial empires, while threatening vital communication routes through the Suez Canal and Persian Gulf. The Gallipoli operation, conceived as a knockout blow that would eliminate Ottoman resistance while opening supply routes to Russia, instead became a bloody stalemate among the rocky hills of the Dardanelles Peninsula. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops stormed ashore at beaches with names that would echo through history: Anzac Cove, Cape Helles, Suvla Bay. Australian and New Zealand troops, many of them farm boys who had never seen combat, found themselves clawing their way up cliffs under Turkish fire. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commanding the Ottoman 19th Division, told his men, "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other forces and commanders can come and take our place." The peninsula's rugged terrain favored defenders who fought with desperate courage against amphibious assaults that would cost the Allies 250,000 casualties. In munitions factories across Europe, women took the places of men who had marched away to war. They worked 16-hour shifts, filling artillery shells with high explosive, their faces yellowed by contact with chemicals that would poison their blood and shorten their lives. Canary girls, they called themselves, their sacrifice as real as any soldiers, though it earned none of the glory. British ordnance factories that had once produced hunting rifles were retooled to manufacture machine guns by the thousand. The Mills bomb factory at Birmingham turned out hand grenades as fast as workers could pull the levers, while Vickers foundries cast artillery pieces whose barrels would soon be thundering death across the Western Front. British pilots, their aircraft held together with wire and canvas, began carrying pistols and rifles aloft to attack enemy aviators. Roland Garros mounted a machine gun to fire through his propeller arc, protecting the blades with metal deflector wedges that sparked when bullets struck them. Fighter aviation was emerging from these primitive beginnings, though wooden biplanes that barely exceeded 100 miles per hour seemed more like toys than weapons of war. Captain Oswald Bölscher of the German Air Service developed the first systematic fighter tactics, teaching his pilots to dive from the sun and break off before enemy reinforcements could arrive. His protégé, Manfred von Richthofen, would soon become the Red Baron, painting his Albatross fighter scarlet as he accumulated victories that would make him the most famous pilot of the war. On the Eastern Front, where space and terrain still allowed maneuver, massive armies clashed in battles that consumed men like fuel. General Alexei Brusilov launched his Great Offensive in June 1916, breaking through Austrian lines with tactics that combined surprise, overwhelming artillery, and coordinated infantry assault. His success nearly knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war, while capturing 375,000 prisoners and 400 guns. Indian troops from the northwest frontier fought in the mud of Flanders, while Gurkhas from Nepal charged German trenches with their curved kukri knives flashing. From Canada came lumberjacks and trappers who brought woodsman's skills to trench raiding, while South African miners proved expert at tunneling beneath enemy positions with explosive charges. The war was indeed becoming global in scope, drawing warriors from every continent into a maelstrom that consumed a generation. By late 1915, the conflict that politicians had promised would be over by Christmas had revealed itself as a struggle that would test civilization itself. In field hospitals behind the lines, surgeons worked by candlelight to save shattered bodies while shells whistled overhead. Nurse Edith Cavell tended German and Allied wounded alike in occupied Brussels, until enemy authorities discovered her role in helping Allied soldiers escape. Her execution by firing squad on October 12, 1915, provided the Allies with another martyr whose memory would inspire recruitment drives across the English-speaking world. Financial costs accumulated like compound interest as national treasuries strained to fund a conflict that consumed resources at unprecedented rates. Britain borrowed £2 million per day, while France mortgaged her future to purchase American supplies. Government bonds with patriotic names, Liberty loans, victory bonds, mobilized civilian savings for the war effort, while inflation began eroding the value of money that families had saved for generations. As 1915 drew to its close, the war that had begun with cavalry charges and colorful uniforms had transformed into an industrial siege where victory would belong to whichever side could best mobilize its factories, finances, and human resources. The age of limited war was ending. The era of total conflict had begun. From the frozen trenches of the Western Front to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the North Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, the clash of titans had settled into patterns that would persist for 3 more bloody years. The optimism of August 1914 lay buried beneath the mud of Flanders, replaced by grim determination to see the struggle through to whatever end awaited. Dawn broke grey and miserable over Ypres on Christmas morning, 1914. Yet something miraculous stirred in the frozen mud between the lines. Private Alfred Dugan Chater of the Gordon Highlanders peered over the parapet to see German soldiers climbing from their trenches, their hands raised and voices calling, "Kamerad." Across no man's land, enemies who had been trying to kill each other for months began walking toward one another through the wire. What followed defied every regulation in every army manual ever written. British and German soldiers shook hands in shell craters while sharing photographs of wives and children left behind. They exchanged cigarettes, chocolate, and addresses, promising to write after the madness ended. Near Messines, a football appeared from somewhere, and grown men who had been professional killers began kicking a leather ball across ground soaked with their comrades' blood. The sight of Bavarian Reserve infantry playing football with the London Rifle Brigade created a moment of humanity that High Command would ensure never happened again. Orders went out from every headquarters. Fraternization with the enemy was strictly forbidden. Machine gun positions were established to ensure that future Christmas Eves would be marked only by the rattle of death. Such glimpses of sanity became increasingly rare as 1915 dawned over a continent that had lost its mind. The trenches that snaked from Switzerland to the sea had evolved from hastily scratched holes into elaborate underground cities where millions of young men lived like rats, emerging only to die in meaningless attacks that gained mere yards at the cost of thousands of lives. Lieutenant Robert Graves of the Royal Welch Fusiliers descended into this subterranean world for the first time on his 19th birthday. The communication trench that led to the front line zigzagged for over a mile through mud that reached his knees, past corpses that had been there so long they served as landmarks. Turn left at Dead Cow Farm, veterans would say, or follow the duckboards past the blonde German. The front line itself defied description. Sandbags bulged with decomposing flesh, while rats the size of cats fed on remains that burial parties could never quite clear away. The stench of cordite, chlorine, rotting meat, and human waste created an atmosphere that new arrivals vomited from until their nostrils grew mercifully numb. This was the killing field where an entire generation would learn the true meaning of industrial death. At Neuve-Chapelle, on March 10th, 1915, British artillery opened the first great bombardment of the Western Front. For 35 minutes, 342 guns fired shells at a rate never before seen in human history, turning German trenches into moonscapes of shattered earth and twisted metal. The barrage lifted at 7:30 a.m., and 40,000 British troops climbed from their holes to walk across no man's land toward objectives they believed would be undefended. Private Jack Mudd of the Liverpool Pals stepped over his own parapet into hell itself. Machine guns that had somehow survived the bombardment opened fire from hidden positions, cutting down entire companies before they had advanced 50 yards. Mudd watched his childhood friends from Liverpool disappear in red mist as German bullets found their mark with mechanical precision. By nightfall, 11,000 British casualties lay scattered across a battlefield that had gained exactly 1,000 yards of worthless mud. The lesson of Neuve-Chapelle should have been clear. Artillery alone could not break the deadlock. Instead, generals on both sides concluded they simply needed bigger guns and longer bombardments. The mathematics of death were about to become truly industrial in scale. German engineers, working in the deep mines beneath the Messines Ridge, were preparing their own innovation. For months, they had been tunneling toward British positions, packing underground chambers with tons of high explosive that would detonate with the force of earthquakes. Mining had become another dimension of trench warfare, as sappers from opposing sides fought deadly duels in tunnels 60 feet below ground. Private William Hackett of the Sherwood Foresters was working in a British tunnel when German explosions collapsed the shaft around him. Rescue teams found him alive but trapped, with barely enough air to breathe. He could have been saved, but another man lay injured nearby. "I am a tunneler," Hackett said through the debris. "I must look after the others." He gave his own oxygen to his wounded comrade and died in darkness, so another might live. Above ground, 2nd Ypres, in April 1915, introduced the world to a new dimension of horror. German scientists had developed chlorine gas as a solution to the trench deadlock, loading 6,000 cylinders along a 4-mile front on the morning of April 22nd. When favorable winds began blowing toward Allied lines, engineers wearing primitive gas masks opened the valves. Yellow-green death rolled across the battlefield like fog from the depths of hell. French colonial troops, caught completely unprepared, fled choking and blinded as the gas cloud enveloped their positions. Men died in agony, their lungs burned raw, their eyes weeping blood as they stumbled toward rear areas in search of air that would not poison them. Private Anthony Hossack of the Queen's Westminster Rifles watched the gas attack from a reserve position. The effect was instantaneous. The men were caught completely by surprise and were overcome before they had a chance to protect themselves. I shall never forget the sight of those brave French soldiers rushing blindly about in the smoke and gas, trying to find their way out of the death trap. Canadian troops hastily rushed forward to plug the gap, improvised protection by urinating on handkerchiefs and pressing the soaked cloth to their faces. The ammonia provided minimal protection against chlorine. but it was enough to let them advance through the dissipating gas clouds. They held the line that day, though at a cost that no previous generation would have understood. The Second Battle of Ypres established patterns that would persist throughout the war. Each new horror, gas, flamethrowers, liquid fire, prompted countermeasures that escalated the technology of death. Gas masks became standard equipment, while chemists on both sides developed ever more sophisticated poisons. Phosgene gas was odorless and undetectable until it began dissolving victims' lungs from the inside. Mustard gas blistered exposed skin and caused blindness that could last for months. Private John McCrae, serving as a medical officer with the Canadian Artillery, watched his close friend die horribly from gas poisoning at Ypres. That evening, sitting in the back of an ambulance, he composed the poem that would capture the war's tragic beauty. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. His words would outlive the empire he served and become the voice of a lost generation. At Gallipoli, meanwhile, the Allied attempt to knock Turkey out of the war had devolved into another bloody stalemate. The landings on April 25th, 1915, had caught Turkish defenders by surprise, but brilliant leadership by Mustafa Kemal had stabilized the front just yards from the beaches. Australian and New Zealand troops found themselves clinging to cliffsides under constant fire, their water rations reduced to half a pint per day, while dysentery ravaged their ranks. Private Ellis Silas of the Australian Imperial Force described the nightmare. We lived in a valley of death where the smell of unburied corpses poisoned the air. Turkish snipers picked off anyone who showed his head above the parapet, while shells fell among us day and night. The flies were beyond description, great fat bluebottles that fed on the dead and then crawled over our food. The August offensive at Suvla Bay promised to break the deadlock through surprise landings behind Turkish lines. Instead, it became another charnel house where British troops died by the thousands in futile attacks against prepared positions. The sight of corpses floating in the azure waters of the Aegean, their red uniforms bright against the blue, provided poets with images of beauty and horror intertwined. General Sir Ian Hamilton, commanding the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, watched his army melt away in the Turkish hills, while politicians in London demanded results he could not deliver. By November, 265,000 Allied casualties had purchased exactly nothing except the knowledge that modern firepower made amphibious assaults against defended positions little better than elaborate suicide. The evacuation of Gallipoli became the campaign's sole success, a masterpiece of deception that extracted 83,000 troops without losing a single man. Auto rifles rigged to fire at random intervals convinced Turkish observers that the trenches remained occupied, while the last boat slipped away under cover of darkness. Even in retreat, the British Empire could demonstrate professional competence that enemies grudgingly admired. On the Eastern Front, where vast distances still allowed maneuver, the war took on different characteristics but equal brutality. General Alexei Brusilov's summer offensive in 1916 broke through Austrian lines with tactics that combined overwhelming artillery with coordinated infantry assault. His success nearly knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war, while capturing 375,000 prisoners and 400 guns. Russian soldiers advanced across the Galician plains in summer heat that turned their wool uniforms into ovens. Many collapsed from exhaustion before reaching Austrian trenches, while others pressed forward with bayonets fixed and voices raised in songs that had echoed across the steppes for generations. The sight of Cossack cavalry charging Austrian machine gun nests provided the last glimpse of warfare as it had been practiced for centuries. Private Alexei Petrov of the 4th Rifle Regiment wrote to his wife from a hospital near Lemberg, "We took the Austrian trenches at dawn, but the cost was terrible. Half my company lies buried in foreign soil, their faces turned toward Mother Russia. I am wounded but alive, and I dream each night of our little village and the sound of church bells calling us to prayer." The Brusilov offensive's initial success prompted Romania to enter the war on the Allied side, a decision that would prove catastrophic. German and Austrian forces, commanded by August von Mackensen and Erich von Falkenhayn, crushed Romanian resistance in a 6-week campaign that captured Bucharest and eliminated another Allied army. Romanian oil fields that might have fueled the Allied war effort instead began supplying German submarines and aircraft. Italian entry into the conflict had opened yet another front along the Alpine borders, where Austrian and Italian armies fought 11 separate battles for control of the Isonzo River Valley. These mountain campaigns combined the worst features of trench warfare with terrain that made every supply run a life-threatening endeavor. Artillery shells that missed their targets triggered avalanches that buried entire companies in snow and ice. Captain Erwin Rommel of the Württemberg Mountain Battalion demonstrated the personal leadership that would make him famous in a later war. At Mount Martailleur in October 1917, he led 150 men in a flanking attack that captured 9,000 Italian soldiers and 81 officers. His tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and aggressive leadership from the front, qualities that traditional trench warfare had seemingly made obsolete. African campaigns, largely ignored by European newspapers, consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, as colonial empires mobilized their subjects for battles that meant nothing to the men who died fighting them. In German East Africa, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck commanded 15,000 German and African troops in a guerrilla campaign that tied down 130,000 Allied soldiers for the war's entire duration. The Askaris, who served in von Lettow-Vorbeck's force, demonstrated loyalty that transcended racial boundaries Europeans claimed were absolute. These African soldiers, fighting for an empire that considered them racially inferior, proved more reliable than many European units. They marched barefoot through jungle and desert, lived on foraged food and captured supplies, and fought with discipline that amazed their enemies. Carrier corps that supported these campaigns suffered casualties that dwarfed those of fighting units. African porters, pressed into service by colonial authorities, died by the thousands from disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition as they carried supplies through terrain that vehicles could not traverse. Their sacrifice received no medals, no monuments, no mention in official histories that preferred to ignore inconvenient truths about imperial warfare. Naval warfare reached its climax at Jutland on May 31st, 1916, when the British Grand Fleet finally encountered the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea, battle both sides had anticipated since the war began. Admiral John Jellicoe commanded 28 dreadnought battleships in a line of battle that stretched across 10 miles of grey water, while Admiral Reinhard Scheer led 16 German battleships in a desperate attempt to break the blockade that was slowly strangling his homeland. The battle cruiser action that preceded the main engagement demonstrated the vulnerability of these fast but lightly armored ships. HMS Indefatigable exploded when German shells penetrated her magazine, taking 1,019 men to the bottom in a pillar of flame that rose 500 feet above the waves. HMS Queen Mary followed 20 minutes later, her destruction so complete that only 9 survivors were pulled from the oil-slicked water. When the main fleets finally engaged, the thunder of hundreds of heavy guns could be heard 100 miles away. Shells weighing as much as small automobiles arced through the air at closing ranges that made hits inevitable. German gunnery proved superior, damaging several British capital ships, but Jellicoe's numerical advantage and tactical position forced Scheer to break off action and retreat toward German ports. Jutland ended in strategic stalemate that confirmed British naval dominance while demonstrating German tactical competence. The High Seas Fleet had survived its encounter with superior numbers, but it would spend the rest of the war bottled up in harbour, while British commerce moved freely across the world's oceans. The blockade that was slowly starving Germany continued unabated. Submarine warfare intensified as Germany sought alternatives to surface action that could not challenge British naval supremacy. U-boats prowling beneath the waves sank merchant vessels without warning, their torpedoes sending ships and crews to the bottom before survivors could launch lifeboats. The sight of women and children drowning in the North Atlantic provided Allied propagandists with atrocity stories that would help bring America into the war. On May 7th, 1915, U-20 torpedoed the passenger liner Lusitania, 18 miles off the Irish coast. Captain Walter Schwieger watched through his periscope as 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, died in the cold Atlantic waters. The ship sank in 18 minutes, her hull torn open by an explosion that witnesses described as like the roar of an enormous beast in pain. Aviation evolved from reconnaissance curiosity to deadly weapon, as pilots discovered the tactical value of fighting for control of the airspace above the trenches. Captain Oswald Boelke of the German Air Service developed the first systematic fighter tactics, teaching his protégés to attack from the sun and break off before enemy reinforcements could arrive. His most famous student, Manfred von Richthofen, painted his Albatross fighter blood red as he accumulated victories that would make him the war's most celebrated pilot. Allied pilots responded with innovations of their own. Captain Albert Ball of the Royal Flying Corps preferred to fly alone, stalking German aircraft through cloud formations before attacking with the fury of a man possessed. His Nieuport fighter, painted bright red like his opponent's machine, became a symbol of British determination to match German skill in the air. The sight of these aerial duels, fought at altitudes where spectators could watch every maneuver, provided the war's only glimpse of individual combat in an age of mass destruction. Pilots who survived long enough to become aces achieved celebrity status that infantry officers could never attain. Their exploits featured in newspapers that ignored the anonymous millions dying in the trenches below. Behind the lines, entire societies mobilized for a conflict that consumed resources at rates no peacetime economy had ever sustained. British munitions factories, working around the clock, produced 76 million artillery shells in 1916, compared to 5 million in 1914. The women who filled these shells, dubbed munitionettes, worked 16-hour shifts in conditions that yellowed their skin and poisoned their blood. Lloyd George's Ministry of Munitions transformed British industry with efficiency that amazed observers accustomed to peacetime leisurely production schedules. Factories that had manufactured bicycles began producing aircraft engines, while textile mills switched to weaving canvas for military aircraft. The invisible hand of market economics gave way to central planning that allocated resources according to military necessity rather than consumer demand. French industry, despite losing the northeastern regions that contained most heavy manufacturing, achieved production miracles through improvisation and determination. The miracle of the Marne, was followed by the miracle of French munitions production, as workshops in garages and cellars began manufacturing artillery shells that kept the guns firing, despite seemingly impossible odds. German industry, cut off from overseas raw materials by the British blockade, pioneered synthetic substitutes that would influence chemistry for generations. Ersatz coffee made from acorns, rubber manufactured from coal tar, and nitrates synthesized from atmospheric nitrogen kept the war effort functioning despite shortages that would have crippled less resourceful nations. By early 1916, the conflict that politicians had promised would end by Christmas 1914 had settled into patterns of attrition that would test each nation's capacity to endure unprecedented losses. The killing fields of France and Belgium had become laboratories where military technology evolved at rates that peacetime innovation had never achieved, while the human cost accumulated in cemeteries that stretched beyond the horizon. Verdun waited ahead, the battle that would test whether French morale could survive the systematic attempt to bleed France white. The war had found its rhythm of destruction, and that rhythm was accelerating toward a crescendo that would shake the foundations of European civilization. In trenches filled with mud and blood, an entire generation was learning that their elders' promises about glory and quick victory had been lies told by men who would never face the consequences of their illusions. General Erich von Falkenhayn stood before a map of France in his headquarters at Charleville, his finger tracing the ancient fortress city that would become synonymous with human endurance pushed beyond all reasonable limits. February 1916 had arrived with winter's bitter cold still gripping the Western Front, yet the German Fifth Army was massing 1,220 guns along an 8-mile front, preparing to unleash hell itself upon the defenders of Verdun. Falkenhayn's strategy was brutally simple: bleed France white by attacking a position she could not afford to lose. Verdun's fortresses commanded the approaches to Paris, their ancient walls symbolizing French resistance in ways that transcended mere military value. He would force the French to feed division after division into a killing machine of his own design, grinding their army to powder while preserving German strength for decisive action elsewhere. At 7:15 a.m. on February 21st, the hurricane began. German artillery, concentrated as never before in military history, opened fire along the entire Verdun sector with a roar that shook the earth 30 miles away. Shells weighing 420 kilograms, Big Berthas, the soldiers called them, fell like meteors from heaven, each explosion creating craters large enough to swallow entire houses. Private Maurice Genevois of the French 106th Infantry crouched in a bunker as the bombardment transformed his world into something from Dante's nightmares. The earth disappeared under a steel hurricane. Trees, rocks, even the dead buried in our parapets were thrown skyward and mixed together in a dance of destruction. Men went mad from the noise alone, a continuous thunder that lasted 10 hours without pause. When the barrage finally lifted, German stormtroopers advanced through a moonscape where nothing lived or moved. Fort Douaumont, pride of the Verdun defensive system, fell to a handful of Brandenburg troops who simply walked through its gates. The French garrison, stunned senseless by the bombardment, offered no resistance as the enemy raised their flag over ramparts that had been considered impregnable. General Philippe Pétain arrived at Verdun on February 25th to find chaos threatening to become complete collapse. Roads clogged with retreating soldiers and refugees, ammunition dumps exploding under German fire, and communications severed by the endless artillery barrage. Lesser men might have despaired, but Pétain possessed the methodical competence that had made him France's most capable defensive commander. His first act was to organize the Sacred Road, the single highway that connected Verdun to the rest of France. Along this lifeline, trucks rolled day and night in an endless convoy that carried fresh troops forward and evacuated the wounded to rear areas. One vehicle passed every 14 seconds for 10 months, their drivers navigating by the light of burning ammunition dumps, while German shells sought to sever this vital artery. Lieutenant Charles de Gaulle, serving with the 33rd Infantry Regiment, experienced the Verdun hell firsthand when his unit counterattacked toward the village of Douaumont on March 2nd. German machine guns, positioned in concrete bunkers that had survived the French preliminary bombardment, swept his men down like wheat before a scythe. De Gaulle himself fell with a bayonet wound through his thigh, then vanished into captivity as his regiment dissolved around him. Month after month, the slaughter continued with mechanical precision that reduced human beings to raw material for the war machine. French divisions entered the Verdun sector at full strength and emerged days later as shattered remnants, their survivors bearing 1,000-yard stares that would haunt them for decades. Entire villages disappeared from the map as artillery fire pulverized stone and timber into unrecognizable debris. Sergeant André Pézard described the transformation. Verdun was no longer a place but a condition, a state of being where death and life mingled so completely that we could no longer distinguish between them. We lived among corpses, slept beside corpses, ate our rations while corpses watched with empty sockets. The boundary between the living and the dead had simply ceased to exist. German losses mounted as remorselessly as French casualties, though Falkenhayn's strategy had promised economy of force. Stormtrooper units that had seemed invincible in February were ground down to cadres by summer, their specialized training wasted in meaningless attacks against positions that could be taken one day and lost the next. The killing machine was consuming its operators along with its intended victims. Captain Ernst Junger of the 73rd Fusiliers found himself commanding 60 men, where a company of 250 had stood weeks earlier. We had become automatons of destruction, feeding shells into our machine guns with the mechanical precision of factory workers. The men no longer spoke of home or victory. Such concepts belonged to a world that had ceased to exist. There was only the next attack, the next bombardment, the next friend to bury in the cratered earth. Fort Vaux fell to German assault in June after a siege that demonstrated human endurance pushed beyond all conceivable limits. Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal and 600 French defenders held the underground corridors for 7 days without water, fighting hand-to-hand combat in darkness lit only by muzzle flashes. When surrender finally came, German officers saluted their defeated enemies in recognition of courage that transcended nationality. The siege's final hours saw Raynal's men drinking their own urine while fighting off German flamethrower attacks in passages where the temperature reached 120 degrees. Carrier pigeons, released with desperate messages, died from poison gas before reaching French lines. When the last pigeon fell dead at Raynal's feet, he knew that surrender was inevitable. Yet even in defeat, he had demonstrated that French morale remained unbroken. By summer's end, Verdun had consumed 700,000 casualties from both armies, without producing strategic advantage for either side. German forces advanced at most 4 miles from their starting positions, purchasing each yard with blood that could never be replaced. The offensive that was meant to bleed France white had instead demonstrated that modern defensive warfare favored the defenders, provided they possessed sufficient will to endure unimaginable suffering. Meanwhile, British forces were preparing their own contribution to 1916's harvest of death. General Douglas Haig, commanding the British Expeditionary Forces, planned a massive offensive along the Somme River that would relieve pressure on Verdun while demonstrating Britain's commitment to victory regardless of cost. His confidence rested on the largest artillery bombardment in military history, 1.7 million shells fired over 7 days at German positions that intelligence assured him would be obliterated. Private Billy McFadzean of the Belfast Volunteers spent the night of June 30th checking his equipment one final time. At 19, he was older than many of his comrades, farm boys and clerks who had enlisted together in a fever of patriotic enthusiasm that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Tomorrow would bring their first real battle, the moment when months of training would finally prove their worth against the finest army in Europe. Dawn broke clear and bright on July 1st, 1916, as 120,000 British troops prepared to advance across no man's land toward German trenches that 7 days of bombardment had supposedly reduced to rubble. Whistles shrieked along the entire front at 7:30 a.m., and young men who had never seen death in industrial quantities climbed from their holes into hell itself. What followed defied every tactical assumption upon which the offensive had been planned. German machine gunners, protected in deep bunkers that artillery could not reach, emerged from underground shelters to find targets advancing in neat lines across open ground. The Maxim guns opened fire with mechanical precision, cutting down entire battalions before they had advanced 100 yards from their own trenches. The 1st Newfoundland Regiment advanced toward the village of Beaumont-Hamel, with colours flying and officers leading from the front. Within 30 minutes, 710 men out of 801 had become casualties, their bodies scattered across ground that would remain in German hands for months to come. The regiment had been recruited from fishing villages and lumber camps, tough men accustomed to hard work and harder living. Now they lay still forever beneath foreign skies. Captain Martin of the Devonshire Regiment kicked a football toward German lines as his men advanced, shouting encouragement until machine gun fire silenced him permanently. The ball, punctured by bullets, deflated slowly in the mud beside his body, while his company melted away around him. By evening, the Devonshires had suffered 95% casualties without reaching their first objective. At Thiepval, German machine gunner Gottlob Herbert counted the advancing British troops with professional detachment. They came forward as if on parade, their officers walking with swagger sticks while their men kept perfect formation. We could not miss at such ranges. It would have been murder to fire into such brave men, but murder we committed because that was our duty. I fired 12,000 rounds that day and hit everything I aimed at. 60,000 British casualties fell on that single day, more than in any 24-hour period in British military history. Entire battalions recruited from single towns and cities were wiped out in minutes, creating grief that would scar communities for generations. The PALS battalions, formed from friends and neighbours who had enlisted together, died together in foreign fields their families would never see. Yet the offensive continued for months with the mechanical persistence that characterized industrial warfare. Each attack promised to be the final push that would break German resistance. Each failure demanded another attempt with fresh divisions fed into the machine. By November, British and French forces had advanced 6 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties, gaining nothing except wasteland too devastated for human habitation. Private Harry Fellows of the Northumberland Fusiliers survived the first day only to face months of subsequent attacks. We advanced and retreated over the same ground so many times that I knew every shell hole by name. Dead Germans and British lay mixed together in the mud, their uniforms rotted away until you couldn't tell friend from enemy. We were fighting for possession of a graveyard that nobody wanted except the rats. Haig's headquarters, safely located miles behind the lines, continued to report progress while casualties mounted beyond all calculation. Staff officers who had never seen no man's land marked territorial gains on maps with colored pins, each advancement measured in yards that had cost thousands of lives. The disconnect between reality and official reports became so complete that senior commanders seemed to inhabit a different universe from the men they commanded. Tank technology made its debut at Flers-Courcelette on September 15th, introducing a new dimension to battlefield destruction. These mechanical monsters, weighing 28 tons and moving at walking pace, terrified German defenders who had never imagined such weapons possible. 49 tanks participated in the attack, though mechanical failures reduced their number to 18 by day's end. Lieutenant Basil Henriquez commanded Tank D-17 Dineken during its first action. We lurched forward at 3 miles per hour through mud that reached our tracks, machine gun bullets rattling off our armor like hail on a tin roof. The heat inside was unbearable, 120 degrees with the engine running, while carbon monoxide from our exhaust nearly poisoned the crew. But we broke through German wire that had stopped every previous attack, rolling over trenches while our guns swept enemy positions clean. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical results, as German infantry fled in panic from weapons that seemed invulnerable to small arms fire. Yet tanks remained primitive and unreliable, their thin armor vulnerable to artillery, while their mechanical complexity ensured frequent breakdowns. Years would pass before technology matured enough to restore mobility to battlefield operations. Artillery evolved throughout 1916 into the war's dominant weapon, consuming resources on scales that peacetime industries had never imagined. British gunners fired over 170 million shells during the year, wearing out gun barrels faster than factories could replace them. The Western Front became a continuous artillery duel, where counter-battery fire sought to silence enemy guns, while infantry cowered in whatever shelter they could find. Creeping barrage tactics developed during the Somme offensive attempted to provide advancing infantry with protective fire support. Artillery would advance its impact points at predetermined rates, creating a moving wall of explosions that ideally stayed just ahead of attacking troops. When timing worked perfectly, this technique could suppress enemy machine gunners long enough for infantry to reach their objectives. More often, miscalculation resulted in troops being shelled by their own guns. Lieutenant Edmund Blunden of the Royal Sussex Regiment described the experience. Our own shells fell among us like iron rain, each explosion throwing up geysers of mud, mixed with whatever had been buried there before. We advanced through this hell with fixed bayonets, expecting German resistance, but finding instead that our own artillery had done most of the work. The enemy trenches contained nothing but twisted metal and unrecognizable fragments that had once been human beings. Medical services struggled to cope with wounds that exceeded anything previous conflicts had produced. High explosive shells created injuries that traditional surgery could barely address, while gas attacks added new categories of suffering to the catalogue of military medicine. Field hospitals became centers of innovation, where doctors learned to treat trauma that peacetime practice had never encountered. Captain Noel Chavas of the Royal Army Medical Corps won the Victoria Cross twice for his work treating casualties during the Somme offensive. Under constant fire, he carried wounded men from no man's land, while German snipers targeted anyone who moved. His medical station, located in a captured German bunker, treated over 200 casualties on a single day, while shells burst overhead and machine gun bullets searched for targets. The wounded, who survived transport to base hospitals, faced recovery periods that could last years. Facial reconstruction surgery, pioneered by Harold Gillies, transformed men whose features had been destroyed by shell fragments, though the results often left survivors barely recognizable to their own families. Prosthetic limbs replaced missing arms and legs with mechanical substitutes that enabled basic function while serving as permanent reminders of what the war had cost. Shell shock emerged as a new category of military injury, though medical understanding remained primitive. Officers diagnosed with nervous breakdown received treatment at special hospitals, while enlisted men displaying similar symptoms faced court-martial for cowardice. The distinction reflected class prejudices rather than medical knowledge, as doctors struggled to comprehend psychological trauma that had no visible wounds. Private Percy Clare of the East Yorkshire Regiment spent 3 months in a shell-shock hospital after breaking down during a bombardment. The doctors said I was malingering, that there was nothing wrong with me that discipline couldn't cure. But I couldn't stop my hands from shaking, couldn't sleep without seeing the faces of dead Germans I had killed with my bayonet. They treated me like a coward when what I needed was understanding that the human mind has limits that artillery can exceed. Supply systems evolved to support armies whose appetites for ammunition exceeded anything previous generations had imagined. Narrow-gauge railways snaked forward from major depots to dump shells, food, and medical supplies at forward positions where trucks and pack animals carried them to frontline troops. These logistical networks became targets for enemy artillery, creating additional categories of non-combat casualties among transport personnel. Poison gas attacks escalated throughout 1916 as both sides developed more sophisticated chemical weapons. Phosgene gas, invisible and odorless, killed by dissolving victims' lungs from inside, while they remained unaware of exposure until too late. Mustard gas blistered exposed skin and caused temporary blindness that could last months, creating casualties who required long-term medical care rather than immediate burial. Gas warfare created its own tactical requirements as troops learned to fight while wearing masks that restricted vision and breathing. Artillery shells filled with chemical agents could contaminate areas for hours or days, forcing defending forces to choose between suffocation and exposure to poison. The sight of horses dying from gas exposure, their larger lungs absorbing fatal doses more quickly than human systems, provided images of suffering that even hardened veterans found difficult to accept. Communication between frontline units and headquarters relied on telephone lines that artillery fire severed faster than repair teams could restore them. Carrier pigeons provided backup communication, though gas attacks often killed these birds before they could deliver their messages. Human runners carried orders through barrages that claimed 3 out of 4 messengers, making command and control a constant challenge for officers trying to coordinate attacks. Signal lamps flashing coded messages provided visual communication when other methods failed, though enemy snipers targeted these devices with deadly accuracy. Wireless radio remained primitive and unreliable, its vacuum tubes vulnerable to concussion, while atmospheric conditions often prevented transmission. Commanders frequently found themselves operating blindly, unable to determine whether their orders had been received or their attacks had succeeded. Fighter aviation evolved rapidly as pilots discovered the tactical value of controlling airspace above the trenches. Captain Manfred von Richthofen, flying his distinctive red Albatros fighter, shot down Allied aircraft with methodical precision that made him the war's most famous ace. His 80 confirmed victories demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic training, combined with aggressive tactics that left no room for chivalric gestures. Allied pilots responded with innovations that emphasized teamwork over individual heroics. Captain Albert Ball preferred to fly alone, stalking German aircraft through cloud formations before attacking with savage intensity. His Nieuport fighter, armed with a Lewis gun, mounted to fire over the propeller arc, became a symbol of British determination to match German technical superiority through superior courage. Air combat casualties, mounted as aircraft, became more capable and deadly. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot dropped to 3 weeks during intensive periods, leading to rapid turnover that prevented most aviators from developing advanced skills. Those who survived long enough to become aces achieved celebrity status that infantry officers could never attain. Their exploits featured in newspapers that ignored the anonymous millions dying in trenches below. Bombing attacks against civilian targets introduced warfare to populations that had previously considered themselves safe from military action. German Zeppelin raids over London killed hundreds of civilians, while demonstrating that geography no longer provided protection from enemy attack. British retaliation against German cities established precedents that would influence strategic bombing doctrine for generations to come. By year's end, 1916 had demonstrated that modern industrial warfare could consume human resources at rates that exceeded any nation's capacity to replace them indefinitely. Verdun and the Somme had proven that defensive positions strengthened by modern engineering could absorb attacks that would have overwhelmed any previous generation's fortifications. The war was becoming a contest of endurance that would test each nation's will to continue fighting regardless of cost. Yet still the armies prepared for another year of slaughter, their commanders convinced that one more offensive would break enemy resistance and restore mobility to static battlefields. The killing fields of France had become laboratories where military technology evolved at unprecedented rates, while graveyards expanded to accommodate casualties that numbered in millions rather than thousands. Industrial civilization had created weapons of mass destruction, and now it was learning to use them with efficiency that previous ages would have considered impossible. Snow fell heavily on Petrograd's streets as Tsar Nicholas II stepped from his imperial train at Pskov station, unaware that he was about to become the last emperor in Russian history. March 2nd, 1917, would witness the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries, brought down not by foreign enemies, but by the weight of military disasters and domestic failures that had made his crown unbearable to wear. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood in the submarine pens at Wilhelmshaven, watching U-boat crews prepare for missions that would either starve Britain into submission or drag America into the conflict. February 1st had marked Germany's return to unrestricted submarine warfare, a desperate gamble that promised victory within 6 months or catastrophic defeat when neutral nations joined the Entente. The Kaiser's admirals calculated that British shipping could be sunk faster than American troops could cross the Atlantic. These twin crises of 1917, revolution in the East and escalation at sea, would transform a European conflict into the first truly global war, while reshaping the political landscape in ways that none of the participants could foresee. Old empires would crumble while new ideologies emerged from the rubble, creating tensions that would define the next century of human conflict. Revolution began not with dramatic proclamations, but with bread riots in Petrograd's working-class districts, women standing in endless queues for food that never came finally lost patience with a system that demanded everything while providing nothing. On March 8th, International Women's Day, textile workers walked off their jobs and into history, their demonstrations triggering strikes that spread across the capital like wildfire. Cossack units, traditional defenders of the imperial order, refused orders to fire on civilian crowds. Some dismounted to shake hands with protesters, while others simply sat their horses and watched as revolution swept past them. When the army would no longer shoot its own people, the Romanov dynasty's fate was sealed regardless of what happened in distant palaces. General Alexei Brusilov, hero of the previous year's offensive, watched from his headquarters as discipline collapsed throughout the Russian army. Soldiers' committees voted on whether to obey orders, while desertion rates climbed toward 100% in some units. "The army is like a machine that has lost its driving wheel," he wrote to a friend. "The parts continue to move for a while from momentum, but the machine is already dead." Nicholas himself seemed almost relieved when forced to abdicate, signing away 3 centuries of absolute power with the same detached calm he might have shown approving routine paperwork. His diary entry for March 2nd read simply, "All around me there is treachery, cowardice, and deceit." History's verdict would be harsher, but Nicholas had at least recognized that his world had ended. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar faced an impossible dilemma: continue a ruinous war that the people no longer supported, or seek peace that would betray their Western allies and potentially trigger foreign intervention. Alexander Kerensky, the lawyer turned revolutionary, who became the new regime's leading figure, chose to honor alliance commitments while promising democratic reforms that required peace to implement. Vladimir Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station on April 3rd in a sealed train provided by German intelligence services eager to spread revolutionary contagion among their enemies. His April theses, delivered from atop an armored car to crowds of workers and soldiers, promised immediate peace, land redistribution, and power to the Soviets. Councils of workers and peasants that had emerged as alternative sources of authority throughout the empire. Lenin's radical program split the revolutionary movement between those who wanted gradual reform and others demanding immediate transformation. His slogan, "Peace, Land, Bread," addressed the 3 issues that mattered most to ordinary Russians, while his promise to end the war resonated powerfully with soldiers who had endured 3 years of defeat and deprivation. Meanwhile, Germany's submarine campaign was achieving success that exceeded even optimistic projections. U-boats prowling beneath the Atlantic's grey waters sank 881,000 tons of Allied shipping in April alone, a rate of destruction that threatened to starve Britain within months. Captain Walter Schwieger, the same officer who had torpedoed the Lusitania, now commanded U-88 in attacks that sent merchant vessels to the bottom faster than shipyards could replace them. British merchant sailors faced odds that made frontline infantry duty seem safe by comparison. The SS Torrington, bound from New York to Liverpool with desperately needed grain, vanished without trace somewhere in the western approaches. 43 men went down with their ship, leaving only oil slicks and floating debris to mark where they had died for king and country. Yet submarine warfare's very success created the conditions for its ultimate failure. President Woodrow Wilson, who had won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," found neutrality impossible to maintain when German torpedoes threatened American lives and commerce. The president who had promised peace now prepared to ask Congress for a declaration that would send 2 million Americans to fight in Europe. The Zimmermann telegram provided the final provocation that made American intervention inevitable. British intelligence intercepted Germany's proposal that Mexico join the Central Powers in exchange for recovering Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, territories lost 70 years earlier in the Mexican-American War. The revelation that Germany was plotting to dismember the United States transformed public opinion overnight. Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary, whose encrypted message had been decoded by British cryptographers, initially denied sending the telegram. When faced with irrefutable evidence, He not only admitted the communication, but defended it as legitimate diplomacy. His honesty destroyed any possibility of German-American reconciliation, while demonstrating remarkable political incompetence. Wilson appeared before Congress on April 2nd to request a declaration of war in language that elevated the conflict into a moral crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy. His words transformed America's entry from strategic necessity into ideological commitment, promising not merely military victory, but global transformation according to American principles. The vote that followed split along sectional lines that recalled the Civil War. Senator George Norris of Nebraska spoke for opponents. "We are going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." Yet majorities in both houses approved the declaration, committing America to its first European war since independence. General John J. Pershing received command of the American Expeditionary Forces, with instructions that reflected Wilson's determination to maintain American independence even as an ally. His troops would fight under American commanders rather than being absorbed into British or French units, a decision that created friction with allies desperate for immediate reinforcement of their depleted ranks. Pershing's arrival in Paris on June 13th provided French morale with a boost that military realities could not yet justify. His promise that "Lafayette, we are here," recalled revolutionary debts, while his 180,000 men represented the advance guard of millions who would follow. Yet American troops remained untested in modern warfare, their training based on frontier conflicts rather than industrial slaughter. French hopes for American salvation came at a moment when their own army was dissolving in mutiny that threatened complete collapse. General Robert Nivelle's spring offensive, launched with promises of breakthrough that would end the war, had instead become another Verdun. Endless casualties for meaningless territorial gains that left survivors questioning whether their sacrifice served any purpose. The Nivelle offensive began on April 16th, with artillery barrages that announced French intentions to every German machine gunner within 50 miles. Senegalese troops and foreign legionnaires advanced across the Chemin des Dames in attacks that collapsed within hours under defensive fire that turned the ancient Roman road into a graveyard for France's colonial empire. Captain Charles Mangin of the colonial infantry watched his Senegalese soldiers die by companies in frontal assaults against positions that preliminary bombardments had barely scratched. These brave men from Africa charged German machine guns with the same courage their ancestors had shown against wild animals. But courage alone could not overcome concrete bunkers and interlocking fields of fire. By evening, my battalion had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Mutiny spread through the French army like plague through medieval villages. Soldiers refused to attack while expressing willingness to defend their trenches, creating a situation where France could avoid defeat but not achieve victory. General Philippe Pétain, recalled to restore discipline, combined limited concessions with selective executions to restore order without addressing underlying grievances. Private Pierre Renaud of the 18th Infantry participated in the sit-down strikes that paralyzed entire divisions. We had endured 3 years of hell. For generals who promised victory was always just one more attack away. Now we would defend our trenches against German assault, but we would not throw our lives away in meaningless offensives that served only to feed the ambitions of politicians who would never face machine gun fire themselves. While France teetered on the edge of military collapse, British forces prepared their own contribution to 1917's catalogue of futile offensives. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, convinced that German resistance was weakening, planned to break through enemy lines in Belgium, with tactics that differed little from those that had failed so catastrophically at the Somme. The Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, to those who fought there, began on July 31st, with preliminary bombardments that destroyed drainage systems reclaimed from swamps over centuries of patient Dutch engineering. Artillery shells that missed their targets shattered canals and dikes, turning battlefield into quagmire that swallowed men and machines with equal appetite. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers described conditions that challenged human endurance. We advanced through mud that reached our waists, losing men who simply disappeared into shell holes filled with liquid clay. Wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated drowned in their own blood, mixed with Belgian slime, while those who tried to rescue them often shared their fate. Canadian Corps Commander Arthur Currie studied the Passchendaele Ridge through his field glasses, calculating that capturing the ruined village would cost 16,000 casualties for ground that possessed no strategic value. His protest reached Hague with mathematical precision. Passchendaele is not worth a single Canadian life. The Field Marshal's response was equally blunt. The attack will proceed as ordered. Currie's prediction proved optimistic. Canadian forces suffered exactly 15,654 casualties, taking Passchendaele on November 6th, capturing ruins so complete that surveyors could not locate where the village had once stood. The ridge that cost so much blood would be abandoned without a fight when German offensives began the following spring. Innovation, amid slaughter, produced tactical developments that pointed toward future warfare. Tank technology matured at Cambrai on November 20th, where 378 armoured vehicles broke through German lines in the war's first successful mechanized assault. For 6 hours, it seemed that mobility had finally returned to static battlefields, as steel monsters rolled through enemy positions like prehistoric predators. Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, architect of the Cambrai attack, watched his tanks achieve breakthrough that 3 years of infantry assault had failed to accomplish. We had proven that machines could overcome the defensive systems that had dominated warfare since 1914. Tanks, advancing without preliminary bombardment, achieved complete surprise, while their armor deflected machine gun fire that would have massacred infantry. The future of warfare was rolling across the Belgian countryside. Yet success turned to disaster when insufficient reserves failed to exploit the initial breakthrough. German counterattacks, led by stormtrooper units employing infiltration tactics that would characterize 1918's campaigns, recaptured most territorial gains, while demonstrating that breakthrough without exploitation remained meaningless. The tanks that had promised revolution were still too few and unreliable to sustain decisive operations. Stormtrooper tactics developed by Captain Willie Raw emphasized speed and flexibility over traditional linear attacks. Small units armed with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers infiltrated enemy positions through gaps in the line, bypassing strong points to attack command centers and artillery positions. These methods would soon threaten Allied positions throughout the Western Front. October brought revolution's second act as Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd through a coup that contemporary observers dismissed as another temporary upheaval. The storming of the Winter Palace on October 25th involved more theatrical drama than actual violence, yet it placed committed revolutionaries in control of the world's largest country at the moment when their promises of immediate peace resonated most powerfully. Leon Trotsky, the brilliant orator who became Commissar for Foreign Affairs, opened negotiations with Germany at Brest-Litovsk, while simultaneously calling for world revolution that would make peace treaties irrelevant. His strategy of neither war nor peace sought to preserve revolutionary Russia without legitimizing German territorial demands, creating diplomatic chaos that suited Bolshevik purposes better than conventional agreements. Lenin's decision to accept German peace terms, regardless of their severity, reflected his understanding that revolutionary survival required ending the war at any cost. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918, would surrender vast territories, including Ukraine and the Baltic provinces. But it would also free Germany's eastern armies for decisive action in France. General Alexei Kaledin organized white resistance in the Don Cossack territories, beginning a civil war that would consume more Russian lives than the World War itself. His appeal for Allied intervention found receptive audiences in London and Paris, where politicians feared that Bolshevik revolution might spread to their own war-weary populations. Private Alvin York of Tennessee arrived at Camp Gordon as a conscientious objector whose Christian beliefs opposed killing under any circumstances. Intensive discussions with his commanding officers convinced him that this war served God's purposes, transforming a pacifist into a warrior whose exploits would make him America's most famous soldier. U-boat warfare reached its climax during Black May, when submarines sank over 860,000 tons of Allied shipping, more than in any previous month of the war. Captain Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière, commanding U-35, became the war's most successful submarine commander, with 194 ships totaling 453,716 tons sent to the bottom. His success rate demonstrated the effectiveness of experienced crews operating improved vessels. Convoy system implementation in late 1917 began turning the tide against submarine warfare. Merchant vessels traveling in groups protected by naval escorts presented more difficult targets while enabling coordinated responses to submarine attacks. The sight of 20 or 30 ships moving in formation across the Atlantic provided psychological reassurance that matched the tactical advantages of concentration. Depth charge technology gave surface vessels effective weapons against submerged submarines for the first time in the war. These underwater explosives, dropped from the sterns of destroyers and patrol vessels, created massive concussions that could crack submarine hulls even without direct hits. U-boat commanders found themselves hunted by enemies, equipped with detection devices and weapons specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. Lawrence of Arabia emerged from the desert campaigns as a romantic figure, whose exploits captured imaginations desperate for heroes in an age of anonymous mass slaughter. His coordination of Arab irregular forces against Turkish communications demonstrated that traditional warfare retained relevance even in the era of industrial conflict. Captain T.E. Lawrence's attack on the Hejaz Railway disrupted Turkish supply lines throughout the Arabian Peninsula, while providing Allied forces with strategic advantages that conventional campaigns could not achieve. His ability to blend European military knowledge with Arab fighting methods created tactical innovations that influenced guerrilla warfare for generations. Medical advances continued as doctors developed new treatments for wounds that exceeded anything previous conflicts had produced. Blood transfusion techniques pioneered in base hospitals saved thousands of lives, while prosthetic devices enabled amputees to return to productive civilian roles. Psychiatric treatment for shell shock began to recognize mental trauma as legitimate medical condition rather than character weakness. Air warfare escalated as both sides developed larger aircraft capable of strategic bombing missions. German Gotha bombers attacked London in daylight raids that killed hundreds of civilians, while demonstrating that no location remained safe from enemy action. Fighter aircraft like the Sopwith Camel and Albatross D-3 engaged in aerial duels, that provided the war's only glimpse of individual combat in an age of mass destruction. As 1917 drew to its close, the conflict had expanded to encompass ideological dimensions that transcended mere territorial disputes. Revolution in Russia promised to spread across war-weary Europe, while American entry introduced democratic idealism that would reshape peace negotiations. The war that had begun as a balance of power conflict was becoming a struggle between competing visions of how human societies should organize themselves. Germany's submarine gamble had failed to achieve decisive results before American reinforcements could arrive. Yet the Eastern Front's collapse promised to free 40 divisions for spring offensives that might still break Allied resistance. The stage was set for 1918's final campaign, when exhausted armies would gather their remaining strength for climactic battles that would determine not only military victory, but the political shape of the post-war world. General Erich Ludendorff stood before his maps in the grey dawn of March 21st, 1918, knowing that Germany's fate hung on the next 100 days. Behind him lay the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed 18 days earlier, which had freed 44 divisions from the Eastern Front for one last desperate gamble in the West. Ahead stretched the killing fields of France, where 3.5 years of trench warfare had created the deadliest stalemate in human history. Operation Michael, the Kaiserschlacht, or Emperor's Battle, would either break Allied resistance before American reinforcements could tip the balance, or exhaust Germany's final reserves in futile attacks against positions that had withstood everything the Empire could throw at them. Ludendorff had calculated that 6,000 guns firing along a 50-mile front would shatter British defences more completely than any previous bombardment. At 4:40 a.m., the hurricane began. German artillery, massed as never before in military history, opened fire with a roar that shook the earth from the Somme to the Scarpe. High explosive shells mixed with gas rounds fell like steel rain on British positions, while counter-battery fire sought to silence Allied guns before they could respond. For 5 hours, the Western Front disappeared under a curtain of smoke and flame. Private George Coppard of the Machine Gun Corps crouched in a concrete bunker as the bombardment transformed his world into chaos. The noise was beyond description, a continuous thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. Our trenches collapsed around us, while poison gas seeped through every crack in our shelters. Men went mad from the sound alone, screaming prayers that no one could hear above the din of explosions. When the barrage lifted at 9:40 a.m., German stormtroopers advanced through fog so thick that visibility dropped to 10 yards. These elite assault troops, trained in infiltration tactics that bypassed strong points to attack command centers and artillery positions, achieved breakthrough on a scale not seen since 1914. Within hours, British front-line trenches that had been considered impregnable were in enemy hands. Captain Rudolph Binding led a stormtrooper company through the British wire, his men moving like ghosts through mist that concealed their advance. We flowed around machine gun nests, like water around rocks, leaving them for follow-up troops while we pushed toward objectives that would cripple enemy resistance. By noon, we had advanced further than any German unit in 3 years of fighting. General Sir Hubert Gough's Fifth Army, holding the extended line taken over from French forces, began to disintegrate under pressure it could not withstand. Entire divisions retreated in disorder, while German spearheads pushed toward objectives that included the vital railway junction at Amiens. For the first time since 1914, mobile warfare had returned to the Western Front. Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, appointed Supreme Allied Commander on March 26th, faced his greatest crisis as German advances threatened to split British and French armies permanently. Meeting with Haig at Doullens, he promised to coordinate defense while preparing counteroffensives that would exploit German overextension. "I will fight in front of Paris. I will fight in Paris. I will fight behind Paris," he declared, echoing words that had saved France before. American doughboys received their baptism of fire at Château-Thierry on June 1st, where the 2nd Division blocked German advances barely 40 miles from Paris. Private Dan Edwards of the Marine Brigade wrote home, "We stopped them cold at Belleau Wood, though the cost was terrible. Marines died by companies in fighting that made no distinction between veteran and recruit. But we held the line, and the Germans came no further." Captain Lloyd Williams of the Marines, ordered to retreat as German forces approached, sent back the reply that became legend, "Retreat. Hell, we just got here." His men would spend 3 weeks clearing Belleau Wood in hand-to-hand fighting that claimed 9,777 American casualties for 6 square miles of devastated forest. German momentum began to falter as supply lines stretched beyond capacity, while casualties mounted beyond replacement. Stormtrooper units that had seemed invincible in March were ground down to cadres by summer, their specialized training wasted in attacks that gained ground but could not achieve decisive victory. The elastic defense that Allied commanders had developed absorbed attacks while preserving strength for counteroffensives. General Sir Arthur Currie's Canadian Corps demonstrated the tactical evolution that would characterize the war's final phase at the Battle of Amiens on August 8th. Coordinated attacks by infantry, tanks, and aircraft achieved breakthrough while maintaining momentum through systematic exploitation. German prisoners, many of them teenagers and middle-aged reservists, seemed relieved to escape a war their empire could no longer sustain. Ludendorff himself called August 8th the Black Day of the German army. After witnessing demoralization that exceeded anything seen in previous defeats, entire units surrendered without resistance, while others simply melted away from positions they no longer had the will to defend. The psychological collapse that followed military failure signaled that Germany's capacity for continued resistance was approaching its end. Meanwhile, the Habsburg Empire was disintegrating from within as subject nationalities declared independence from Vienna's increasingly fictional authority. In Prague, Tomáš Masaryk proclaimed Czechoslovakia's birth, while Emperor Karl's desperate promises of federalization came too late to save a multinational state that had been held together only by inertia and habit. Lieutenant Colonel Alois Podajski of the Austrian cavalry watched his multinational regiment dissolve as Czech and Polish soldiers simply walked away from positions they no longer considered worth defending. The empire that had survived Napoleon could not survive the democratic idealism that Wilson's 14 points had unleashed among peoples who wanted to govern themselves rather than be governed by others. Bulgaria's collapse in September removed Germany's southeastern ally from the war while opening Allied supply routes to Russia that had been closed since 1914. King Ferdinand's abdication ended a dynasty, while General Louis Franchet d'Esperey's polyglot army advanced through the Balkans like a liberation force rather than an occupying power. Turkish resistance crumbled simultaneously as General Edmund Allenby's forces captured Damascus and Aleppo, in campaigns that combined conventional operations with Arab irregular warfare. The sight of Lawrence and Faisal entering Damascus together on October 1st symbolized the end of Ottoman power in the Middle East, while creating new problems that would plague the region for generations. Captain T.E. Lawrence watched Arab and British forces liberate ancient cities that had known Turkish rule for 4 centuries. We had promised the Arabs independence in exchange for their revolt. Yet I knew that Britain and France intended to divide these lands between themselves. The victory we celebrated would become the betrayal that haunted my conscience for the rest of my life. Enver Pasha, architect of Turkey's entry into the war, fled Constantinople aboard a German submarine as his empire collapsed around him. The Committee of Union and Progress that had ruled through the Young Turk Revolution could not survive military disasters that had cost Turkey half her territory and most of her population. Austria-Hungary sought a separate peace, as German alliance became a liability rather than protection. Emperor Karl's October Manifesto, promising federal reorganization, triggered declarations of independence throughout the empire, while Magyar politicians in Budapest prepared their own accommodation with victorious allies. Revolution erupted across Germany as naval mutinies at Kiel spread inland like contagion, carried by returning soldiers who had lost faith in military leadership. Sailors of the High Seas Fleet, ordered to sortie for a final battle against overwhelming odds, refused to sail on missions they considered suicidal gestures designed to preserve officer honor at the cost of enlisted lives. Seaman Karl Artelt led the Kiel revolt that began when Admiral Reinhard Scheer ordered the fleet to sea for one last confrontation with British naval forces. We would not die for the Admiral's pride when the war was already lost. Better to survive and build a new Germany than perish for an emperor who had brought us nothing but defeat and starvation. Workers' and soldiers' councils sprouted throughout the Reich as authority collapsed from the bottom up rather than the top down. In Munich, Kurt Eisner proclaimed a Bavarian socialist republic, while Spartacist revolutionaries in Berlin prepared to follow the Bolshevik example that had destroyed the Tsarist regime. Kaiser Wilhelm II, abandoned by his generals and threatened by revolution, abdicated on November 9th, rather than face the fate that had befallen his Russian cousin. His departure to exile in Holland ended the Hohenzollern dynasty, while creating a power vacuum that competing political factions would struggle to fill. General Wilhelm Groener, Ludendorff's replacement as quartermaster general, advised the Kaiser that the army would no longer fight for the monarchy, but might still serve a new government that could preserve order while negotiating peace. His calculation proved correct as social democratic politicians assumed power while relying on military support to prevent Bolshevik revolution. Friedrich Ebert, the saddle-maker's son who became Germany's first Republican leader, faced impossible choices as his provisional government struggled to maintain authority while negotiating armistice terms that would prevent occupation. His decision to cooperate with military commanders who had served the Kaiser created tensions that would undermine democratic institutions for years to come. Matthias Erzberger, the Catholic politician who headed Germany's armistice delegation, crossed Allied lines on November 8th, carrying authorization to accept whatever terms the victors might impose. His journey to Foch's railway car in the forest of Compiègne symbolized the complete reversal of fortune that had transformed Europe's most powerful military machine into a supplicant begging for mercy. Marshal Foch received the German delegation with cold courtesy that reflected 4 years of devastation and 20 million deaths that could never be forgiven or forgotten. His armistice terms demanded the surrender of weapons, territory, and resources that would make renewed resistance impossible, while keeping Germany under Allied control during peace negotiations. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent after 51 months of continuous firing. Private Archie Surfleet of the Devonshire Regiment wrote in his diary, "An incredible silence settled over no man's land, as both sides emerged from their trenches to stare at enemies who had become familiar through 4 years of mutual slaughter. We had survived what we believed would be the war to end all wars. Captain Harry Truman, commanding a battery of the American Expeditionary Forces, fired the last shot of the war at 10:59 a.m. before ordering his guns to cease fire. That final shell seemed to carry with it all the hopes and fears of a generation that had sacrificed everything for victory we could barely comprehend. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound I had ever heard. Celebrations in Allied capitals mixed joy with grief as populations that had endured unimaginable sacrifices struggled to comprehend that their ordeal had finally ended. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace while church bells rang for the first time in 4 years. Yet even in victory, the dead cast shadows that no amount of jubilation could dispel. German civilians, many of whom had believed until the final weeks that victory remained possible, reacted to defeat with shock that bordered on disbelief. The army that had advanced to within 40 miles of Paris just months earlier had collapsed so completely that resistance seemed inconceivable to populations that had sacrificed everything for the war effort. Starvation throughout Central Europe had weakened resistance to influenza pandemic that would kill more people than the war itself. The Spanish flu, spread by returning soldiers and displaced populations, claimed victims across the globe, while medical services struggled to cope with diseases that conventional medicine could not treat. Austrian prisoners of war, released from Russian camps, carried revolution homeward as they witnessed the collapse of empires and the birth of new nations. Many never reached homes that no longer existed, their families scattered by armies that had transformed familiar landscapes into unrecognizable battlefields. Industrial demobilization began immediately as munitions factories converted to peacetime production, while millions of workers faced unemployment in economies that had been distorted by 4 years of total war. The transition from military to civilian production would prove almost as difficult as the original mobilization had been. As snow began falling on the western front's abandoned trenches, the magnitude of what had occurred slowly became apparent to survivors who had lived through humanity's greatest catastrophe. 4 empires had vanished, 20 million people had died, and the political map of Europe had been redrawn according to principles that promised lasting peace, but created new sources of conflict. The war that was supposed to end all wars had instead demonstrated civilization's capacity for self-destruction on scales that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet from the ashes of the old order, new nations were emerging with democratic ideals that offered hope for a future where such carnage might never be repeated. The armistice that ended the fighting was not peace itself, but merely the opportunity to begin building a world that might justify the sacrifices of those who would never come home. President Woodrow Wilson stepped from his train at the Gare des Invalides on December 14, 1918, greeted by crowds that hailed him as the prophet of a new world order. Parisians who had endured 4 years of siege and bombardment saw in this American president the embodiment of ideals that promised lasting peace through democratic principles and international cooperation. Yet behind the cheering throngs lay devastation so complete that reconstruction would consume a generation. 9 million soldiers lay buried in cemeteries that stretched from Belgium to Romania, their graves marked by crosses that stood in silent rows, like wheat cut down before harvest. Private Henri Barbus of the French infantry, wounded at Verdun and invalided home, walked through Père Lachaise cemetery, reading names of friends who would never again see Paris in springtime. An entire generation rests beneath these stones. Boys who sang love songs and dreamed of futures that artillery shells had blown away forever. 20 million wounded veterans struggled to rebuild lives that bore little resemblance to the world they had known before August 1914. Captain Ernst Junger, whose storm of steel would immortalize the German war experience, returned to find a homeland transformed beyond recognition. "We were strangers in our own country," he wrote. Warriors from a conflict that civilians could never understand, carrying memories that peacetime had no place for. Influenza pandemic, carried across continents by demobilizing armies, killed more people than the war itself, while overwhelming medical services already strained by 4 years of treating unprecedented trauma. Dr. Victor Vaughan, Surgeon General of the US Army, watched helplessly as disease claimed victims faster than bullets had. The flu struck with biblical fury, taking the young and healthy while sparing the old and weak. We had survived humanity's greatest war only to face nature's most deadly plague. Refugees, numbering in millions, wandered across a continent where familiar borders had been erased, and new nations were emerging from the ruins of fallen empires. Maria Komnenos, whose family had fled Constantinople as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, described the journey that millions were making. "We carried everything we owned in suitcases and bundles, searching for countries that might accept us as citizens rather than unwanted strangers. The war had made nomads of us all." In Paris, the Big Four, Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando, gathered in Clemenceau's office to reshape the world according to principles that often contradicted each other. Democratic self-determination clashed with strategic security, while desires for justice competed with demands for revenge. The peace they would craft would satisfy no one completely, while creating grievances that would fester for decades. Georges Clemenceau, the tiger who had led France through her darkest hour, entered negotiations determined to ensure that Germany could never again threaten his homeland. At 77, having witnessed 2 German invasions, he possessed no illusions about human nature or the permanence of peace treaties. Woodrow Wilson speaks like Jesus Christ, but acts like Lloyd George, he observed with characteristic cynicism. Wilson's 14 points, which had inspired German surrender, promised a peace based on open diplomacy, free trade, and national self-determination, overseen by a League of Nations that would prevent future wars. Yet European allies who had sacrificed everything for victory were more interested in security and reparations than in idealistic experiments that might benefit their enemies. David Lloyd George, Britain's pragmatic Prime Minister, sought a balance between Wilson's idealism and Clemenceau's desire for revenge. Having won election on promises to squeeze Germany until the pips squeak, he faced domestic pressure for harsh terms, while recognizing that excessive punishment might create future instability. His challenge was to satisfy voters without destroying European recovery. Secret treaties, negotiated during the war's darkest hours, promised territorial gains that contradicted Wilson's principles, while reflecting the desperate bargaining that had held the alliance together. Italy demanded territories promised in the Treaty of London. Japan insisted on retaining German concessions in China, and France expected the return of Alsace-Lorraine, plus additional security guarantees that would keep Germany permanently weakened. German delegation, led by Foreign Minister Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, arrived at Versailles on April 29, 1919, expecting to participate in negotiations that would produce a peace based on Wilson's promises. Instead, they found themselves treated as criminals awaiting sentencing. rather than representatives of a sovereign state. The treaty they received on May 7th exceeded their worst fears, while violating every principle upon which they had agreed to surrender. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, assigned complete responsibility for the conflict to Germany and her allies, creating legal justification for reparations that would burden the German economy for generations. Brockdorff-Rantzau read the clause with barely concealed fury. Germany is to acknowledge that she and her allies are responsible for all loss and damage suffered by the Allied powers. We are asked to sign our own death warrant as a nation. Territorial provisions carved away 13% of Germany's European territory, while eliminating her overseas empire entirely. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Saar Basin fell under League administration, and the Rhineland became a demilitarized zone occupied by Allied forces. Most painful of all, the Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, while placing 3 million ethnic Germans under foreign rule. Military restrictions reduced the German army to 100,000 men, while prohibiting tanks, aircraft, submarines, and poison gas. The navy was limited to 6 battleships and 12 destroyers, while conscription was forbidden in favor of long-term volunteers, who could not be rapidly expanded for aggressive wars. Allied occupation of the Rhineland would continue for 15 years to ensure compliance. Reparations demands exceeded Germany's capacity to pay, while creating economic instability that would plague Europe for decades. The final bill, 132 billion gold marks, represented twice Germany's annual pre-war gross national product, payable over decades that would extend the war's economic consequences well into the future. John Maynard Keynes, resigning from the British delegation in protest, predicted that such terms would create vengeance disguised as justice. Emperor Wilhelm II, safe in Dutch exile, was declared a war criminal whose extradition the Allies demanded for trial before an international tribunal. Holland's refusal to surrender the former Kaiser created the first test of international law, while establishing precedents for prosecuting heads of state for crimes against peace. The tribunal never convened, but the principle had been established. Austria-Hungary's dissolution created new nations, while leaving unresolved minorities throughout Central Europe. Czechoslovakia emerged with substantial German and Hungarian populations who had never sought inclusion in a Slavic state. Yugoslavia united South Slavs under Serbian leadership, while incorporating Croats and Slovenes who preferred autonomy to Belgrade's dominance. Poland's resurrection, after 123 years of partition, restored one of Europe's historic nations while creating new sources of conflict. The Polish corridor that provided access to the sea divided Germany while placing ethnic Germans under Polish rule. Danzig became a free city under League administration, satisfying no one while creating future pretexts for German intervention. Hungary, reduced to 1/3 of her historic size, lost territories containing millions of ethnic Magyars to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Admiral Miklos Horthy, commanding a navy without a sea in a country without ports, became regent of a kingdom without a king, while nursing grievances that would eventually align Hungary with revisionist powers. Ottoman Empire's dismemberment created mandates that divided Arab lands between Britain and France, despite promises of independence that had inspired the Arab Revolt. T.E. Lawrence watched from the conference galleries as his wartime promises were betrayed. We had told the Arabs they would govern themselves after victory. Instead, we divided their lands between European empires that would rule as colonial masters under League supervision. League of Nations, Wilson's greatest achievement, established headquarters in Geneva, while lacking the military power necessary to enforce its decisions. The United States Senate's rejection of membership crippled the organization from birth, while demonstrating American reluctance to accept permanent international commitments despite Wilson's global ambitions. Japanese demands for racial equality, rejected by Western powers unwilling to challenge colonial hierarchies, revealed the limited nature of democratic ideals that applied only to European peoples. The mandate system that replaced German colonies with League supervision merely substituted international oversight for direct control, while maintaining Western dominance over non-European territories. Russia's civil war raged on with Allied intervention, supporting white forces against Bolshevik rule. British, French, American, and Japanese troops occupied strategic points while supplying anti-communist armies that lacked popular support. The intervention's failure ensured Soviet hostility toward Western powers, while validating Bolshevik claims about capitalist encirclement. Lenin's new economic policy temporarily restored market mechanisms while consolidating Bolshevik control over territories that had belonged to the Tsarist Empire. The Soviet Union that emerged from civil war would challenge Western values, while offering an alternative model of development that appealed to peoples seeking rapid modernization without democratic constraints. Economic reconstruction proceeded slowly as European industries retooled for peacetime production, while absorbing millions of demobilized soldiers into civilian employment. War debts accumulated during 4 years of unprecedented spending created fiscal burdens that limited governmental capacity for domestic investment, while requiring continued taxation at wartime levels. International trade patterns, disrupted by blockades and submarine warfare, required complete reorganization as former enemies sought to rebuild commercial relationships. German exclusion from global markets during the transition period weakened recovery while strengthening competitors who had captured German markets during the conflict. Currency instability throughout Central Europe reflected the economic chaos that followed imperial collapse. German marks, Austrian kronen, and Hungarian pengos lost value as governments printed money to meet obligations they could not otherwise satisfy. Inflation became hyperinflation as middle-class savings evaporated and social stability crumbled. Women who had replaced men in factories and fields faced pressure to return to domestic roles as veterans demanded jobs that wartime employment had given to others. Yet the war had demonstrated female capabilities, while creating social changes that could not be completely reversed. Suffrage movements gained momentum from wartime contributions, while traditional gender roles adapted to new realities. Colonial empires, strengthened by League mandates that legitimized continued European control, faced new challenges from subjects who had contributed to victory while learning about democratic principles that their rulers proclaimed but did not practice. Veterans returning to colonies carried ideas about self-determination that would eventually undermine imperial authority. American withdrawal from European affairs left Britain and France to maintain a settlement that required resources they no longer possessed. War-weary populations demanded domestic reconstruction rather than international police duties, while economic constraints limited military commitments that peace enforcement would require. By December 1919, as the conference delegations finally departed Paris, the framework for post-war Europe was complete but unstable. New nations celebrated independence while nursing grievances against neighbors who had gained territories they claimed. Defeated powers accepted harsh terms, while planning eventual revision of settlements they considered unjust. Seeds of future conflict had been planted in soil, fertilized by 20 million graves. The war to end all wars had created conditions that made another conflict almost inevitable. while establishing precedents for ideological struggles that would reshape human civilization. Democracy and dictatorship, capitalism and communism, nationalism and internationalism, all the forces that would define the 20th century had been unleashed by a conflict that began with an assassination in Sarajevo and ended with treaties signed in Parisian palaces. Wilson returned to America a broken man, his health shattered by efforts to save a peace treaty that his own countrymen would reject. The idealist who had promised to make the world safe for democracy lived to see his dreams frustrated by political realities that his moral vision could not overcome. Yet his failure contained within it the seeds of future American engagement with international affairs that would ultimately vindicate his belief in democratic principles. Paris had witnessed the creation of a new world order that satisfied no one while creating grievances that would fester until they exploded into another war even more destructive than the one that had supposedly ended all wars. The victors had won the peace they deserved rather than the one they needed, ensuring that their children would face choices their parents had hoped never to see again.